It's been live
Yay.
streamed. Okay.
Okay, guys. Hi, I'm Liz Cuffs, and I am a person with a master's degree in sociology. And today we're going to go over some stuff about gender identity. What is gender identity and how do we get there? Because it's gotten confusing in recent years. So we're going to figure this out. You might be familiar with some or all of these terms, and that's okay. If it seems like we, are covering ground you already know, feel free to just chime in and let me know. Okay, so here is a PowerPoint. Let's share the PowerPoint. We are gonna go with the slideshow from the beginning. Okay, so these are some gender identity slides put together by myself. What is gender? If you're a sociologist like myself, you believe that gender is a social construct based on norms, behaviors, and societal roles expected of individuals primarily based on their biological sex. Social construction is something that doesn't exist independently as part of nature, but instead is an invention of humans in society. So its existence, characteristics, and function depend on our shared agreement that it exists. We know something is a social construct often because it changes across time and cultures. So you might be able to see some of these pictures in the slides are different ways genders of people dress. I think this woman is very famous for being the first reporter to have a Maori face tattoo. So that's not something every culture has. Yeah, so you can see how gender is done differently in fashion in different situations across time and cultures. Let's see, most cultures have a binary gender system. This means two genders, as in a man or a woman. But some cultures also have recognized a third gender, a gender spectrum, or in some cases categorized homosexual people as a third gender. For example, the Native Americans of the Southwest use the term two-spirit to describe a gender variant individuals in their community. Okay, how do you get a legal sex or gender assigned at birth? Well, it's really just what you think, right? A baby's born, a medical professional or someone looks between the baby's legs and examines its genitals. If they see a penis and a scrotum, the baby is a boy. And they write boy, they write male on the birth certificate. If they see a vulva, which is the female external genitalia, it's a girl, and they write female on the birth certificate. Most of the time, that's all that happens. The person's chromosomes are not examined. Nobody takes an image of their internal gonads. It's not very complicated. So, but when we say it's assigned at birth, gender is assigned at birth, or sex is assigned at birth, that's really all that's being talked about. Your biological sex, which is the thing that's thought to underlie gender, right? You've probably heard of some of these components. You have sex chromosomes, which are XX or XY, usually, though other variations can occur. There's a gene in fetal development that lives on the Y chromosome called the SRY gene, which it plays a critical role in taking this indifferent stage of the fetus down one of these paths. If you have an SRY on your Y chromosome, this genital tubercle here develops into a penis. And if you don't have it, a series of other events happen that creates the female external genitalia. Gonads are your internal organs, such as ovaries and testes that produce reproductive cells like ovum and sperm eventually. Hormones, we think of estrogen and testosterone as the most well-known sex-associated hormones, but many other hormones interact to create feminine and masculine appearance at birth, and also secondary sex characteristics like breasts and an Adam's apple and facial hair later in life. Cells. So this is one people don't always know. Whether or not cells are sensitive to the presence or absence of, or excuse me, whether or not the cells are sensitive to the presence of sex hormones can greatly influence the expression of biological sex traits. And the last one, which has been studied in a number of ways, is called brain structure or brain wiring. And this is still being researched, but may also play a key role in shaping gender identity or sexual orientation. So, okay, what happens in the case where a baby is born and its genitalia, not its, but their genitalia, I did that wrong, Roz, is ambiguous. So these genitalia, these are some line drawings of genitalia that previously were referred to as ambiguous. To many physicians practicing today, intersex genitals, which is what these are not actually considered ambiguous. They are the result of known intersex conditions with a predictable range of morphology. So you can kind of see this, they're not all represented here, but this is aphalia, which is the first two sections of the genitals didn't develop. Clitoromegaly, in which a person has like female labia, but a clitoris that looks large and sort of like a penis. So there are a bunch of different kinds. Ovigestis, which was formerly called true hermaphrodism, occurs very rarely in humans. Means that the individual has both ovarian and testicular tissue present. And these are different shapes that a person with that condition can have. So if you know, I'm showing these to you not because I have some strange interest in genitalia, but because I want people to know that these are natural shapes that occur from time to time, and if we know about them, they're not a surprise and they're not ambiguous. Okay, intersex people are individuals born with any of several sex characteristics, including chromosome patterns, gonads, or genitals that do not fit the typical binary, meaning male or female, notions, right? So if this is from the Intersex Society of North America, you can go to this website, and if you want to read about these different conditions, that is available to you. Okay, so gender, back to gender. Aspects of gender are socially constructed because they change across time and cultures. Here are some specific ways in which we socially construct gender. So how do we do that? One thing is gender norms. A gender norm is a behavior or attribute in that society attributes to a particular sex, like having pink for girls, blue for boys. We also have gender roles, which are encompass a range of behaviors and attitudes, but it would be like an occupation or a job or a role that you do because you are one sex or the other. You might hear sort of like a stereotypical thing would be seeing cooking as women's work or bricklaying as man's work. Gender expression or gender performance are ways that we show to the world, including learn and perform behaviors based on cultural norms. So like clothing choice, hairstyle, lipstick, your name, maybe your choice of pronouns. And sexual scripts are ideas of how males and females are supposed to interact with each other, men and women interact with each other, including how each gender should behave in a sexual or romantic situation. So these are two different kinds of wedding proposals. In one that looks very Victorian, we have a man trying to propose to a woman. And in this other one that looks very modern, the woman is proposing to the man. So whether or not that second one is acceptable, right, or who should propose to who is a function of a sexual script or like a norm. So, okay. So we have to talk also about, whenever people hear norm, they also think about normal. Normal is made up, but what we have here is cis heteronormativity. That's like the technical term for what you might be already familiar with. And it has 3 components. The first is binary gender. So we're talking about a society where people are assumed to have a binary male or female gender. The second is cisgender. People are assumed to have an internal identity, a feeling of their gender that matches the sex they were assigned at birth. And heterosexual is the third one, which is sexual orientation is, even though it's no longer considered part of a person's gender identity, but its own thing, these things often are thought to occur together, in so that a man will be attracted to women and women will be assumed to be attracted to men. So these are different gender identities. Cisgender, we've talked about, which is a person whose biological sex, gender assignment matches their internal sense of themselves. So that would be a man who is assigned male at birth and also identifies the world as a man. A transgender person, their biological sex and gender assignment at birth does not match their internal sense of themselves. So a man or a person who is assigned male at birth who identifies as a woman. And then there's some other ones you might not have heard of, like agender, which is a person who does not identify with a gender. Gender fluid would be a person who does not identify themselves as having a fixed gender. They sort of feel like they could move between those two things back and forth. Bigender is a person who has 2 gender identities, possibly that they use at different times or at different social circumstances. And genderqueer would be a person for whom some aspect of their gender identity does not fit with the normative ideas of gender in their culture. I'm trying not to read all of these slides because I'm trying to go very quickly. Gender shaming this slide is very important though, is so important because it's the primary method by which gender norms are enforced. Men and women both participate in gender shaming. Gender shaming for women and girls often involves criticism for failing to live up to numerous and often contradictory expectations, right? So women can be shamed for not being attractive, like, oh, she looks like a dog, or they can be shamed for dressing like too attractively, like, wow, she went out dressed like that. Women can be shamed for their behavior. If they engage in too much sexual behavior, right, they can be considered a slut. Or if they engage in not enough sexual behavior, they could be called a prude. And women are shamed for being more assertive and competitive in the workplace, like told, oh, you would, or for not being assertive enough, you would get that raise if you would just, ask for it or something. But then if they do behave competitively and assertively, they're often perceived as like bitchy and not very feminine. In contrast, gender shaming of men and boys is often done by comparing them disparagingly to women and girls. Men learn that they are not supposed to be feminine or be like a girl or like feminine things. Weakness and vulnerability in all forms, like athletic or emotional, are particularly shamed for men and considered feminine. So like that's saying boys don't cry. Oh boy, slide's getting ahead of me. boys don't cry, you throw it like a girl, you're a sissy, stuff like that. Enjoyment of anything deemed culturally feminine may be shamed. So if you're a man or a boy who likes soft colors or textures, or a job or activity that is traditionally done by a woman, people might bully you for that. Gender shaming for men can overlap with sexual orientation shaming, right? Particularly in cultures that don't make a good distinction between gender and sexual orientation. So the fear of being identified or shamed as gay is a form of homophobia, which is a prejudice or statement or stigma about homosexuality. And you've probably heard people shame men this way, be like, you're so gay or whatever, like you're flower arranging now, that's gay. Somebody might say that would be gender shaming. One thing we can do now that we know what gender shaming is refrain from doing it. If you see somebody doing something that you don't think should be part of their gender, just maybe don't say that to them out loud or to anybody else. Gender ideology is a term you hear a lot, which is amusing because when I was in school in the early 2000s, gender ideology was something feminists objected to. When we did that, we meant traditional gender ideology. Now, when you hear it, most often it's conservatives talking about dangerous gender ideology, and they mean feminist gender ideology. So traditional gender ideology, so it's important to always, when you're discussing gender ideology, talk about whose gender ideology you're talking about. Gender ideology is a system of beliefs and values which form the basis of a type of thought, political, economic, social, or otherwise, about gender. So traditional gender ideology draws many of its ideas from older Judeo-Christian religions and may include belief that there are distinct roles for men and women, like men as leaders and breadwinners and women as stay-at-home mothers, a strong preference for heterosexual marriage as like a social good and an exclusion of other kinds of relationships and marriages, like a single parent as a social good. They wouldn't view that as social good. A belief that differences between men and women have natural and biological foundations and are not the result of some kind of social construction. Belief that people cannot or should not choose their own gender, that biological sex is, or that gender is a result of biological sex or else divinely ordained, or a belief that non-heterosexuals and trans people are unfortunately sexual perverts or mentally ill, and should be excluded from things. So in contrast, that's traditional gender ideology can have those kinds of elements, but progressive, feminist, liberal, or postmodern gender ideology draws many ideas from academic fields of research, such as psychology, sociology, or anthropology, and often includes things like belief that one's gender should not exclude a person from access to roles, occupations, rights, activities, resources, etc. And that systems of government that control and concentrate resources and political power in the hands of men, while excluding women or underrepresenting them and non-binary people, are unbalanced, unfair, or oppressive. This kind of ideology might also have the belief that gender is socially constructed and non-binary, non-heterosexual, and trans identities are valid and acceptable. Also, the belief that some elements of traditional gender ideology, such as rape culture and toxic masculinity, are dysfunctional in society and should be discontinued. Rape culture is the belief that victims of sexual assault, rather than perpetrators, have provoked the assault and therefore are responsible for what happened to them. Toxic masculinity refers to beliefs and stereotypes associated with men that encourage or normalize aggressive, violent, misogynistic, homophobic, or transphobic behaviors. So that's like boys will be boys, man up, boys don't cry, punching someone will get them to respect you, stuff like that. So that's what that is. How did we get here? So one thing that is sort of important to understand about the ongoing debate between these is the case of Dr. Money and David Reimer. Dr. Money was a psychologist at Johns Hopkins University in 1986 when Mr. and Mrs. Reimer brought him their son, who had been injured in a circumcision accident. You guys might remember this because it's been in several TV shows and documentaries. As a behavioralist, Dr. Money believed humans were born as a blank slate and that gender was solely the result of socialization. So he convinced the Reimers that the solution to raising a boy who had lost his penis was to reassign his gender to female, do surgery to remove his testes and raise him as a girl, and provide him estrogen treatment when he reached puberty. So the Reimers agreed to do this and changed the name of their son to Brenda, as Dr. Money suggested. Dr. Money continued to treat Brenda and report on the success of his treatment for 14 years. One part I left out. The injured child, Brenda, had a twin brother, and so this was like the ideal situation for an experiment to test theories. Anyway, he saw them both and allegedly did some weird therapy involving them practicing sex positions and inspecting each other's genitalia. During that time, he published papers that influenced thousands of gender reassignment surgeries on intersex children, particularly chromosomally male babies who were born with a condition called micropenis, which would have looked ambiguous to people who didn't know what that was. By age 14, Brenda, who was bullied at school and already experiencing gender dysphoria, threatened suicide rather than to see Dr. Money again. Brenda's parents took her to see a different psychologist who told them it was time to tell the child the truth about what had happened. After being told the information at age 15, Brenda immediately transitioned to a male identity, assuming a new masculine name, David, and the process of reversing the surgeries and hormone treatments, and began the process of reversing surgeries and hormone treatments. David later married a woman who already had 3 children. He was convinced to tell his story publicly, and books and documentaries about his experience were created. Unfortunately, his twin brother became mentally ill and died from a drug overdose. David's parents felt that mental illness was also the result of Dr. Money's therapy. And then 2 years later, David's wife asked for a divorce and David committed suicide, dying by firearm at age 38. So this is like a really tragic case, but the worst thing about it was for this 14-year span of history, doctors were being told that just do surgery. And if you socialize a person, they will, they had the gender of rearing, which is what they were they thought that could create someone who was a different gender. But the lessons they learned, the first thing is that people have an internal sense of gender identity, which is what we're here to talk about today. That is separate from their biological sex and separate from their socially assigned gender or gender of rearing. So that's really interesting because it means that you can't just raise anybody as anything and have them turn out what you intended. They might have a different internal feeling than even what society is telling them they are. And the second thing is the treatment of injured or intersex children involving non-life-saving genital or gonadal surgery on children too young to consent for themselves, lying to them about their medical conditions, or treating their bodies as pathological is unethical. treatment instead should include counseling for parents. So now that is, if you were to have an intersex child today, that's what they would give you counseling to make sure you understood what was happening. Gender and pronouns. We hear a lot about pronouns now. Words with he, she, words are like he, she, him, or her. In the past, people would choose pronouns by assuming someone else's gender, by looking at their gender performance, their physical appearance, or behaviors, and guessing what gender they were. Now it's okay to ask people politely, what are your pronouns, as a way to allow others to tell you what gender they are, rather than you having to guess. This is good because for non-binary and transgender people, the pronouns others would guess for them might not fit, can create discomfort and anxiety. Think about if people just looked at you and were always using the wrong pronouns on you, you would feel very unhappy. We have also in English language use now non-binary pronouns, which is like a singular they or them. So I have a friend, Alex, who uses pronouns, and they prefer it that way. And so that is what I always do when I see them. There are also some people who use neo-pronouns, which are words like z or zer or z or zir. Okay, yeah, even though it is a third person singular gender neutral replacement for a proper noun in English, this should still never actually be used on a person. It is a word we use for monsters and inanimate objects and animals. So using it as a pronoun for a person is dehumanizing. And there's a link if you want to read more about pronouns. Okay, so now for something completely different. This is love. If you want to watch this wonderful TED Talk I've linked to here, you can. This researcher, Dr. Helen Fisher, has put people into a functional MRI machine and using scans of their brain has discovered 3 circuits in the brain for love. The first is lust, which is sexual desire, a drive for sexual gratification or orgasm, which can cause a dopamine spike, which may or may not lead to romantic interest. The second love circuit in the brain is romantic love, which is focused attention to achieve a pair bond. It's a persistent drive for people to focus on one partner. It may have addiction or like obsession-like features, such as extreme emotional highs and lows. And she says the evolutionary purpose is for pair bonding and mating to settle down. And then the third circuit of love in the brain is long-term attachment. And that's feelings of safety, calm, peace, and belonging, and tolerance, which she believes exists for the purpose of raising children and maintaining family ties. This is some other research. So why do we have to understand that? Well, because understanding that those are 3 different things is going to help us in the rest of these slides understand the difference between sexual orientation and romantic identity and things like that. So this is the Kinsey scale. Alfred Kinsey was a famous biologist and sexologist who did a lot of research by various methods and eventually developed this thing, which is called the Kinsey scale, when he noticed that people he felt were on a spectrum of sexual orientation from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. And so he became famous for sort of postulating that a lot of people were in between, in the middle, bisexual or occasionally homosexual or incidentally heterosexual. People found that to be an astonishing thought, that some of the time they are not exclusively heterosexual because we have cis heteronormativity. That was surprising.
Oh. Liz, there's something about the previous diagram that was puzzling to me. You had zero was exclusively heterosexual, and then you have 1 is incidentally homosexual, and you have 5 is incidentally heterosexual, and 6 is exclusively homosexual.
Yeah,
so I'm
you're
wondering
right.
if those got like switched around.
I think they did get reversed. I should have read that. My bad. Yeah, I think this should say.
Oh, I think it's because what it is 1 is mostly heterosexual, but only incidentally homosexual, and 5 is mostly homosexual, but only incidentally heterosexual.
Oh, okay. Oh, that makes sense.
Incidentally means incident by incident. So it's like, sometimes an incident pops up and you're like, oh, I guess I'm not all the way straight or not all the way gay. So
yeah.
that's why that's that way.
That was just really confusing to me. Just
sorry.
Super confusing. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah, I mainly wanted to show you this picture to see how we've moved from sort of thinking everyone was one way, but no, maybe there's a spectrum, and now we have sexual orientation. So the concept of sexual orientation, particularly I cannot read today. Non-heterosexual orientations has changed considerably over time. At various times, it's been seen as a behavior, sometimes a sin, a separate gender, a preference, or an identity, but now we see it as an orientation. So orientation, and this is really important, is defined by the ability to feel sexual attraction. It's not a function of your behavior, who you have actually had sex with, or whether you choose to openly reveal your orientation to the world. Sexual orientation may be different than romantic orientation or long-term bonding in some individuals. So we're gonna move on to that. These are categories of sexual orientation. You've probably heard of lesbian, a woman who feels attracted to another woman; bisexual, a person who feels sexually attracted to men and women; gay, a man who feels attraction for other men; transgender, that's not a sexual orientation, but it's in this community with all the letters. Queer or questioning, the Q in the LGBTQ, is someone who is not still unsure about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And they've also decided to include intersex in here, which we've already talked about. Asexual is a person who rarely or never experiences sexual attraction. And they also figured out at some point that libido was a spectrum, right? You can be very, very highly interested in sex, or you just, maybe you don't feel very much sexual attraction at all. And that's, another kind of thing. The plus sign is to allow for the inclusion of other groups as they emerge, like pansexual, which is people attracted to others regardless of their own or others' gender identity. And of course, heterosexual, we know what that is. These are all the rainbow, not all the rainbow flags, but these are some flags people have used to show off their pride in their sexual orientation. So romantic identities, it's possible that you have a different romantic identity from your sexual identity. For some people, like if your sexual identity is that you're asexual, you might not really feel sexual attraction to anyone, but still be able to feel romantic obsession or romantic attraction to somebody. And so these are all they follow about the same format. One that's different is demi-romantic, which is romantic attraction towards any of the above, but only after forming a deep emotional bond with the person. So that was interesting to me, because I was raised thinking that all heterosexual interactions were, or romances were supposed to be that way. And actually that's apparently just a subset of them. Okay, so one thing that happens is with these gender identities is that often in society you will see the pathologization of a non-binary gender identity or sexual orientation. So the term gender dysphoria has been used by psychologists to denote the condition of a person experiencing discomfort or distress because of the mismatch between their biological sex and gender identity. It's also sometimes been called gender identity disorder, gender incongruence, or transgenderism. What causes someone to form a non-binary gender identity is still unclear. It's still being researched. If brain structure or brain wiring impacts gender identity formation, then it's possible non-binary gender identities have a biological basis. So that's still something that is trying to be discovered. Some thought leaders espouse explanations for non-binary gender identity or sexual orientation that pathologize transgender, non-binary, and LGBTQ people, which means to regard them as psychologically abnormal or unhealthy, not cis heteronormative, right? Rather than part of the natural human variation. So the following things in this column down here are explanations for non-binary gender identities that are controversial and actually offensive to the people they've been applied to. So if you hear about some of these, tread carefully, I guess, is what I would say. Abuse, the hypothesis that the reason people become homosexual or bisexual is because they were sexually abused in childhood. We know this is bunk because lots of people are sexually abused in childhood and they don't all adopt a different kind of identity or sexual orientation. Autogynephilia, you might see this around. This is the hypothesis that biological males who are aroused by the idea of themselves as a female are motivated by this paraphilia, which is a psychological term for abnormal sexual desire. It's probably not that abnormal though, to build trans woman identities. So this is insulting because it's basically saying, well, you want to be a gender other than your biological sex because you're a pervert. So that's not nice. Conversion or reparative therapy built on the hypothesis that it's possible to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. This is the pseudoscientific practice of attempting to do so using psychological, physical, or even spiritual interventions. There is no reliable evidence that sexual orientation or gender identity can be permanently changed this way. Practices have included lobotomies, chemical castration, electroshock to the genitals, and masturbatory reconditioning, which sounds horrible and probably is. 20 states and 100 municipalities in the United States have made it illegal to do this type of therapy on minors. And I think there's actually one that has made it illegal to do it on adults as well. And the last one is rapid onset gender dysphoria as a social contagion. This is the hypothesis that rising number of teen trans identities are due to peer pressure or attention seeking. So that's, we can know why that is offensive, because it's saying that like someone's identity is basically a phase, which is, not cool. So these are non-LGBTQIA plus identities you might have heard about. These are not considered part of this community. One is pedophile. In the United States, sexual abuse of children is considered a heinous crime, illegal in all states and on the federal level. Recently, some scholars have pondered whether pedophilia, which is attraction to prepubescent children, is a persistent condition that some people are born with, similar to a sexual orientation. Some have suggested that if we recognize this way, we could possibly do more to prevent those people from acting on their instincts and harming children. This has become a very controversial topic. I was going to link to a TED Talk here, which was very interesting, but unfortunately it was taken down because there have been death threats from people on all sides who really don't want pedophilia or the attraction to minors to be recognized or put in the same category as an adult sexual orientation. Another thing you might hear, the word incel does not mean the same thing as asexual. An incel is not asexual. An incel is a person who is usually a heterosexual male. This is not a sexual orientation at all, but a large online self-help community for heterosexual men who are frustrated with some aspect of their relationship or lack thereof with women, particularly their lack of ability to have sex with them. And the important thing to know about these groups is, yeah, asexual is a different thing from incel. Asexuals don't feel a lot of sexual attraction or any, so they wouldn't be angry. Incels are angry because they do have heterosexual sexual orientation attraction that they feel is not, their needs are not being met, and they often blame women for this. And these groups were thrown off popular social media sites after it was discovered that people who had gone on to do mass shootings, such as Elliot Rodger of women, had posted manifestos and threats prior to doing that. So these groups are considered now as hate groups. So my last slides are just some gender controversies. You probably know about this already. Should we have intersex and trans women in sports? This controversy began in the United States as an anti-Soviet propaganda, raising the suspicion that male athletes from the USSR had been altered to appear female so they could outcompete female athletes in the Olympics. To deal with this, gender verification was instituted at the Olympics in 1966, and it continued until 1999. So this is an issue that is still being talked about today. There are still many athletic contests that do not allow women and trans people, or do not allow trans people to compete. So the issue of whether trans women who have undergone a social, hormonal, or surgical transition should be allowed to compete in women's sports functions to divide feminists. So it's one thing, you might have heard this term, trans exclusionary radical feminist, or TERF. It's considered a slur by the people who are negatively labeled with it, but that is a feminist who espouses the belief that that they do not accept trans women into women's organizations, spaces, or sports. So trans people and bathroom safety. Most resources I was able to find on this say that there are no reported cases of anyone using a transgender identity to gain access to a woman's bathroom for the purpose of committing rape. But it's a thing that many states, including Arizona, Florida, Texas, and Kentucky, have considered or considering enacting a so-called bathroom bills, which restrict transgender people from using bathrooms in line with their gender identity, and are framed as protective measures against sexual predators. So really, you can see gender being constructed in front of you, right? Like, we're gonna legally create this category of people who can't use the bathroom. That is kind of a shocking thing, but this is how it happens, right? We're gonna debate it, and if everybody agrees, then that's gonna be a new legal thing. I would propose designing better bathrooms. Single gender bathrooms are potentially more dangerous to women because heterosexual male rapists know a woman's bathroom is a place where the next person who walks in is very likely to be his intended target, a woman. all gender bathrooms are less attractive to heterosexual male rapists because they know the next person who walks in may or may not be a woman. It could be another man. Single occupant, all gender bathrooms with safety features like a sliding door, so an attacker cannot hide behind it, or an alarm to summon the police if an attack starts happening in the bathroom, would be a better way than a law against transgender bathroom uses to protect women against rape in a bathroom. Okay. Okay, so this is my last slide, and it's just that Roz is going to talk about Swedenborgian and Swedenborgian communities and gender. And so I just wanted to put a little historical context out there. When Swedenborg wrote about gender, he wrote about binary gender. Binary gender roles as they were understood during his lifetime. He was born in 1688 and died in 1772. In historical context, his passing was 133 years before sex chromosomes, XX and XY, were discovered, 200 years before electronic medical records were a thing that allow people to compile all those intersex conditions and study them. 214 years before John Money started his experiment on David Reimer to test whether gender identity was the result of socialization and not inborn, and 234 years before social media sites like Facebook and Twitter went worldwide and allowed trans and non-binary identifying people to express themselves publicly and share their experience in the world. So in conclusion, we've come a very long way in a short amount of time, and that's the end of my slideshow. So I will unshare this screen. Does anyone have any questions? I see 7 comments are in the chat that I haven't had time to look at. So let me just take a look here. Okay, yeah, that is fun. A great way to assess how much you adhere to gender norms is Harvard's implicit association test. So Paige has put that in the comments. Thank you. The link to that. I wonder if we could get a copy of the slides of the printouts. Yes, we can put them on the website afterwards or even email them.
And by the website, we're meaning Deborah's Tree website. Just
yes.
be clear what that is. Yes.
Gender shaming, recent study in Utah on the workplace. Yes, very interesting. I have loved knowing what gender shaming is because it means like I wasn't able to stop myself from doing it until I knew what it was. So just knowing that has been so helpful for me. I've been told to add they, their to my pronouns to make public I am supportive of non-binary people. This tells students immediately in our online teaching environment. Yeah, that's true. You can say my pronouns are she, her, and also comfortable with they, their, and that will let people know that you're cool with non-binary pronouns. Women hearing or reading sacred texts that refer to mankind and use masculine pronouns can be experiencing ongoing gender anxiety that could interfere how they feel about that text. That is totally true. And I feel you on that. I definitely have that problem thinking of God as a man all the time or mankind. It's a little weird. Thank you, Roz and Julie. Okay, so I think that's all the text messages. Does anybody, I see a hand. Would you like to?
Yes, I had a question about, in general, thank you for the presentation, Liz. It was very thorough and I felt like it gave it a good framework. I was especially struck by the slide about the 3 different brain paths for sexual relationships by Helen Fisher.
Yes,
and,
yes.
I mean, I think it's good as far as it goes, but it's so lacking more the dimension of human experience that includes spirituality and transcendence was sort of missing from it.
Yeah, well,
and I think I'll just one more thing.
Okay.
I just want to say that being in love and falling in love involves a whole range of rich and creative and spiritual feelings, and it includes lots of things like storytelling and just the feeling of being able to look at someone and just love them because they're just so beautiful in a sexual way is just a very special and precious part of life. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you would like the TED Talk that is linked more because she's using a functional MRI machine to look at stuff in people's brains. So she doesn't have the ability to make like a spiritual inference from it, but I think she would probably agree with you.
Cool.
Does anyone have any other questions, or should we proceed to Roz's? Julie?
Yeah, I was going to say about the masculine pronouns. I've been battling the general church with that for quite some time. And when, I'm going to read something, say for the preparation for the informal service, and it's got he's and hims, I automatically change them. And I think Roz does that too, don't you?
Yes.
Yeah, just automatic. It's just so awful to have been opened up to seeing the fact that everything was in masculine terms in my interfaith training, that it's like a bell that goes off. So
yeah, it can cause a lot of anxiety, which is a good segue to Roz's. Roz, do you want to go?
I do, and I want to say thank you very much. It was wonderful. And so I'm going to start my part about perspectives in the Swedenborgian and New Church organizations, just a few of them, the ones that I was able to find out about. And I'll just tell my little personal reason for jumping into this, other than that it's a very sort of hot topic in our culture in North America, is that as most of you know, my day job is being a nurse in the recovery room at a big hospital, Temple University Hospital, which has become a center in definitely the Philadelphia and actually further areas for gender affirming surgeries. For probably 2 years. And so I've been taking care of people from when they first come in for their first appointments to get ready for the surgery till after the surgery, and walking with them through that, and which has opened my eyes to a lot of the issues, and also brought up for me questions about, well, really, what are the teachings that are relevant? Like how does this work? So that's kind of my perspective in coming to this. So in order to come up with this information about the different Swedenborgian and New Church organizations, I looked at websites, I did internet searches, I got some documents from some of the leadership, and I was involved in email communication of various kinds. And sort of my conclusion, I'm just going to give this up front. In general, the organizations that do not consider the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg to be as divinely inspired as the Hebrew and Christian scriptures are more likely to take into consideration Swedenborg's cultural context for everything that he wrote, including anything about gender or men and women, any of that sort of kind of stuff. And they take that into account when they're reading and applying Swedenborgian theology to their own lives and to the collective lives. And so organizations, like I said, that do not consider Swedenborg's writings to be as divinely inspired are more likely to intentionally interpret the teaching in ways that are consistent with their own current cultural context. The reason I say intentionally is because everybody does that, but to be more intentional about it and to consider current cultural and scientific and sociological perspectives when I'm dealing with these scriptures, or I said scriptures and I'm talking about the writings of Swedenborg, but also the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. Also, these organizations are more likely to adhere to the liberal or feminist gender ideology, and they are less likely to pathologize LGBTQIA identity. Sorry, I just trip up over those letters all the time. So I'm just going to go sort of historically through the New Church and Swedenborgian organizations, just in the order that they entered the world. So the first one is the General Conference of the New Church in the UK, which began in 1789. And from their website, they say that they promote spiritual growth through the application to life of the word and the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. I couldn't find anything written other, so some from email communication, that there's been a long debate within the conference ministers meetings about homosexuality and gender. And they have not come to any kind of resolution, and so nothing has been published. And part of what is causing this lack of resolution is that it contains sensitive issues and pastoral needs and doctrinal stances that are sort of at odds. So I'm assuming from that there is a range from liberal ideas of inclusion and to traditional and conservative ideas about gender and marriage. And I noticed that their decision in that case is to be sensitive to pastoral needs and to make no public statements until the resolution can occur, if it does. So for this group, and for all of them really, I've just sort of highlighted some of the theological statements in Swedenborg and also in the Bible. And they apply to most of them. So, but I've kind of laid it all out here for the conference. So you can sort of understand maybe where they're coming from a text perspective. Swedenborgian theology about pastoral goals is that priests are to teach truths and by these lead to good and thus to the Lord. And that real charity is dealing fairly and faithfully in whatever position one is engaged in and with those with whom one comes into contact. Dealing fairly and faithfully. I'm just going to say I'm reading from translations that I got, and I'm not trying to do what I normally do, which is make them gender inclusive. And I'm referring to God as God, if that's how, in male ways, if that's how the translation is. And so biblical teachings for inclusive acceptance of all gender identities would be from Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. And from John 15, love one another just as I have loved you. And Jesus said that, and it was notable that it was inclusive of sinners and Samaritans, but he was not shy about naming shortcomings when he saw them. So that's an example of how we might want to love other people and love ourselves. There are also biblical teachings for accepting only binary and male-female genders. And of course, Genesis is a good source for that. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them male and female. He created them. And he said, be fruitful and multiply. And God saw all that he made, and it was very good. Further on in Genesis, a man leaves his father and mother and unites with his wife, and they become one family. And that was quoted in Mark, and then in Mark, the comment was added, therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. So in these biblical teachings about binary and female genders, it immediately goes to procreation, family, marriage, man and wife, or husband and wife, or man and woman. Maybe better ways to say that. So now here's some Swedenborgian theology examples that support inclusive acceptance of all gender identities, which you maybe wouldn't think are there, but it's kind of hidden. From Secrets of Heaven, the word contains an internal or spiritual sense for angels and an external or natural sense for people on earth. Doctrine of the word. The spiritual meaning of the word is all about the Lord and his kingdom, and is the meaning that engages his angels in heaven. And then back to Secrets of Heaven. When a marriage is the subject in the word, the heavenly marriage is meant in the internal sense, which is the marriage of good and truth. And in the highest sense, the divine marriage, which exists within the Lord. The reason I say that those teachings support acceptance of all gender identities, that it is saying whenever anything's written about man, woman, marriage, any of that, don't get stuck in the literal, but look at the internal meaning. The internal meaning is the important part. That's where the angels are resonating with it, and find out what these teachings mean about the marriage of good and truth within you, and the the divine marriage in heaven. And that's where the focus could be. But there is also Swedenborgian theology that could support both accepting only binary male female genders and accepting inclusively all the gender identities. This is from the Doctrine of the Word. The Word is like a clothed person whose hands and face are bare. Everything that has to do with how we live and therefore with our salvation is bare, while the rest is clothed. And in many places where the meaning is clothed, it shows through like a face seen through a thin veil. And so that opens up the debate. Is anything in the Word, like those examples in Genesis about that are clear about male, female genders? Is that something that is bare? Is it something important for our life and our salvation? Or is it really something that is clothed and really the meaning is what's behind the veil? Opens up that question. There is Swedenborgian theology, of course, that supports accepting only binary male-female genders. From Conjugal Love, the male's masculinity pervades the whole and every part of him, and likewise a female's femininity. The intelligence of women is in essence modest, refined, peaceful, yielding, gentle, and tender, but that of men is in essence serious, harsh, hard-spirited, and disposed to license. And in that particular number into Conjugal Love 218, he goes on quite a bit about the differences in physical appearance and in spirit between men and women. Also from Conjugal Love, wives are forms of love, men receivers of love, two different kind of forms. And then further on, earlier in the piece, but whatever. After death, a man is a man and a woman is a woman. And there is nothing in the soul, mind, or body which is not male in the man and female in the woman. These two have been so created as to strive to be joined, in fact, to be joined into one. And of course, you could look at these numbers and say, well, after death, a man is a man and a woman is a woman and an intersex person is intersex and a transgender person is, you could say this goes on, whatever you are or comfortable with, whoever you are in your natural life will continue in your spiritual life. But on face value, it's just talking about men and women. So I think those are the sort of considerations and scriptures and so forth that would have been used in general conference, in the ministers' meetings, that would create controversy and a difficulty to resolve because there's some on both sides of the argument. So the next Swedenborgian community that I'm going to look at is the General Convention, also known as the Swedenborgian Church of North America, and that was established in 1817. And from that website, we are an open-minded, forward-looking Christian church, drawing its faith from the Bible as illuminated by the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg. So notice that both the conference in the UK and the Swedenborgian Church of North America are drawing from the Bible or from the Word, and it's illuminated or it's somehow explained by Swedenborg. So Swedenborg is not at the same level of divine authority as the Word. What I'm choosing to share here from the Swedenborgian Church is a standing resolution which is adopted by the General Convention in 2019, and it's a statement of the Swedenborgian Church of North America on discrimination. Here it is. As Swedenborgians, we affirm the core truths of our faith that honor the diversity of both heaven and earth and recognize that loving people who are different from us is integral in the practice of a religious life. Wait, is somebody trying to get in? No. We also acknowledge that broad generalizations of races, nations, and then genders and sexual orientations and other things can be found in our sacred text, which, when interpreted literally, these texts have been used on occasion to promote opinions that run counter to these core truths. We hereby affirm our responsibility to interpret our texts in the light of love and inclusion in heaven's light, and we reject interpretations of the Bible or of Swedenborg's writings that promote a discriminatory viewpoint. And then they say if anybody associated with a church says or does anything that doesn't reflect or represent the practical doctrine of the Swedenborgian Church, that we don't stand with them. And then it also asks people to regularly investigate our actions and beliefs, both individually and collectively, to align them with these truths so that we can be greater vessels for divine love in the world. So obviously the core teachings of this perspective in the convention is love and inclusion. So the actions that I see this community taking are to interpret texts from love and inclusion, to refrain from discrimination, and to regularly investigate actions and beliefs. And the goal would be to be greater vessels for divine love in the world. So, what are the teachings from the Bible and from Swedenborg that are relevant here? Well, everything that I said about inclusion for the general conference, but also biblical teachings about loving people who are different from us. Jesus was asked, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners, which is what most spiritual leaders wouldn't have done. And in Matthew, the Son of Man will reward each person according to what he has done, not according to what their gender is or what their belief system is, but if all kinds of different people will be rewarded for what they've done. And there is Swedenborgian theology that supports loving people who are different from us, from Secrets of Heaven. For everyone throughout the whole world who has led a good life is in the Lord's mercy received and saved, everyone, honoring all paths. The Lord's mercy is infinite. This is also from Secrets of Heaven. It does not allow itself to be restricted to the few within the church, but reaches out to everyone on the face of the earth. From True Christianity, there is a heaven for Muslims, just as there is a heaven for all people who acknowledge one God, who live what is just, and who do what is good as a religious practice. And along these lines of loving people who are different from us, angels stir up nothing but goods and truths in people, and things that are evil and false, they excuse. That's sort of tangential, but I'm using it as an example of it's possible to make excuses or just disregard things that are different from us or from how we see things. Important in the Swedenborgian church community understanding of gender identity, Swedenborgian theology in support of heavens for LGBTIQA plus people. So basically, I'd say these are heavens for people that are not in the one man, one woman marriage scenario. In conjugal love, those who choose unmarried life are sent to join their like who live on the fringes of heaven. Maybe on the fringes, but definitely heaven. And the Muslim heaven is actually divided into two heavens. In the lower of the two, Muslim men live honorable lives with multiple wives. It's spoken from a male point of view, of course, but it's affirming that you don't have to be living in a monogamous one man, one woman marriage to be living in heaven. And then this is also relevant to the to this statement that I read, Swedenborgian theology about continual self-examination and purifying, from Secrets of Heaven. For in heaven, purification takes place constantly, which is, so to speak, a new creation. Yet the situation is that no angel to all eternity can possibly attain complete perfection. And neither can we in our understanding of gender identity, and in the way that we deal with it personally, and there's room for improvement all the time. And a call to do that, to examine and improve. The next organization I'm going to look at, founded in 1885, was the New Church in Australia. And that website says this: the new church in Australia is based on spiritual practice and development, as they are shown in the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg and given in the Lord's word. So I'd say that statement kind of straddles the where is the authority, because it does talk about spiritual practices in the writings and given in the Lord's word. It doesn't quite call Swedenborg the Lord's word, but my information here is based on email communication and also my experience in the new church in Australia. But in various email contexts, there was a report about a person who went to an interfaith meeting where LGBTIQ people talked about themselves and faith. And then sort of the important message, the takeaway was that it was important to listen to lived experience, and that everybody's story is a human story, regardless of their gender identity. And sort of a plea to allow any person to be accepted in the presence of the word and to learn how to live their life based on the word, and to reflect, asking for self-reflection on whether we are really willing to allow and encourage people to come into community in the church. Somebody else wrote in the email list that I was reading that sometimes strictly applying the rules isn't the right thing to do. And regardless of what your take is theologically on queer issues, because there might be a variety, listening to lived experience is very important. Recently, I gave a talk that some of you were at in the New Church in Australia virtual retreat. And originally, I actually proposed to give a talk on gender identity. I thought I could hit two birds with one stone and just prepare one talk. And that request, was not honored, or I don't know, that isn't the right word. But anyway, a decision was made and a compromise that I would talk about Deborah's tree instead. But there was still nevertheless interest expressed in welcoming people with a variety of gender identity and gender experience into the churches, and how we can meaningfully interact and how we can actually do that, and an acknowledgement that it's kind of early on in that trend within the new church in Australia, but that it's something that they would like to pursue in the future, and maybe there'll be opportunities for discussion, and maybe discussion would be less threatening to people than an actual sort of lecture about it. Open it up gently with a discussion. So what I learned from my email communications and so forth is that there is an emphasis in the new church in Australia on listening to lived experience and getting clarity about our responses to LGBTIQA plus people. That there's a movement towards opportunities to explore thoughts and feelings and possible responses, and not really a commitment, but an interest in pursuing the issue in the future. So the goal at this point, as I can see in that community, is that persons are to gain value from being accepted in the presence of the word and being allowed to encouraged to find lessons there for life, regardless of their gender identity. A goal to welcome people with a variety of gender experience into the churches, and to meaningfully interact with LGBTIQ people and serve their spiritual needs. And the challenges are we actually capable of doing that? Can we do more self-reflection if we need to? Acknowledging that there's different theological takes on queer issues, and that it's still maybe threatening. So I think all of the teachings that I have been able to just mention so far as pastoral goals, inclusion, loving people who are different from us, heavens for LGBTIQ, acceptance of all gender identities, but also acceptance of only binary gender identities, and also the need for continual self-examination and purifying. I think all of those teachings are sort of feeding into, or the basis of, where the Australian New Church is currently. Aside from cultural considerations, which is true for all communities and all people. Okay, the next Swedenborgian New Church community that I'm going to look at is the General Church of the New Jerusalem, which was founded in 1890. The website says, New Church theology is founded on the belief that God used Swedenborg as a vessel through which to spread his teachings to people on earth. During a process of divinely inspired revelations, Swedenborg wrote 35 volumes of theological books referred to as the writings or the heavenly doctrines. And so that puts the General Church of the New Jerusalem into the category of communities that give divine authority to Swedenborg's writings. The document that I'm going to be referring to came out from the executive bishop, so that's the top of the hierarchy of priests in the Academy of, in the General Church. And it's a letter that went out to the Academy of the New Church, which is the educational sort of branch of the General Church. And this one came out in August of 2021. A person who had previously identified as female changed their pronouns and their name. And so a human resources had sort of sent out some kind of letter to all the employees of the academy about that. And so the bishop's response, I'm not going to read it, but the salient points that he made was that Brunch College employees have a legally protected right to choose their name and pronouns. That in the college, they're going to continue educating based on the word, meaning the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the heavenly doctrines given through Emanuel Swedenborg. The bishop continues with a commitment to New Church teachings, and that means standing for a beautiful and comprehensive vision of marriage, that human beings are created male and female, are formed with complementary natures for the sake of marriage and for the sake of families that can flow from them, and that that he and all of us, I guess, need to deal fairly and faithfully with the people with whom we come into contact. He also gave a call for calm and respectful dialogue as we find the most helpful word-based path forward. So the actions that seem to be recommended here for the General Church are find the most helpful word-based path forward to maintain calm and respectful dialogue, and to maintain a consistent respect for the marriage of one man and one woman in both language and behavior. And he quoted that also from the employee handbook for the Brunch College. And the goals would be to remain committed to the teachings of the New Church and stand for and understand marriage, and deal fairly and faithfully with everyone, and to have their actions based on the teachings of the Word, which is, again, specifically the Old Testament, the New Testament, and Swedenborg's writings. I will say I still get a little confused when people go immediately from gender identity to marriage. I guess I'm putting marriage in the sexual orientation sort of category, and to me they're different things, but important to note here in the history of the General Church that for various reasons, teachings about marriage have become sort of the primary, most elevated teachings, as opposed to other organizations that maybe emphasize regeneration or the internal sense of the word more. So in addition to all those teachings that I had mentioned before, for the General Church positions or perspectives, Swedenborgian theology in support of heterosexual marriage and reproduction are important. Conjugal love, the conjugal love of a man with one wife after their agreement and compact unites their souls. It is from this marriage of good and truth as its own true source that the holiness of marriages on earth is derived, as well as the marriage laws laid down in the Word. And marriage's purpose is higher than that of all else in creation, since it is the propagation in due order of the human race and also of the heaven of angels, since this comes from the human race. And so gender identity, I'm assuming, is put into that lens, like, well, if people with identities that are not male and female cis male and female, I suppose, are not going to be reproducing and are not going to be creating heaven. I'm putting words into the mouth of the general church, but that seems to be the implication. And of course, there's Swedenborgian theology about a life based on the word, which comes across as very important in that document. What forms and establishes the church in miniature in any of us is not the word. It is the faith based on true perceptions and the life based on good actions that we individually draw from the word and apply to ourselves. That's from True Christianity, which is a more nuanced way of approaching trying to find a path forward that is based on the word. The next group that I'm looking at is the New Church in South Africa, which was founded in 1909. Now, there's many different Swedenborgian and New Church organizations in South Africa. I happen to have contacts with people in the New Church in South Africa, so I'm just going to speak about this one. And some of what is true for this group is true for most people in the African content, but may or may not be. So for this group, the internet search revealed that in 1909, Reverend David Mucke was convinced that the Lord had made his second coming as described in Swedenborg's book. And so he started an organization, and then he found out that there was already one in England. And so in 1921, he was ordained into the New Church, which aligned the New Church in South Africa with the conference, the British conference, and so for a long time and probably till now, the perspectives on the Old Testament, the New Testament, and Swedenborg is probably what is holding true, but I don't know that for sure, but I'm assuming that. From email conversations, gender identity is not an important issue for the people in the New Church in South Africa. Most of the people in that church Black Africans who are very poor. They're living in poverty. So their focus is on housing, food, and unemployment. And so basically, I might get a polite answer about gender identity is not an important issue, but basically the thinking is that's a white person's issue in North America. You all can worry about that. We're just trying to survive day to day. Gender roles in South African society are traditional, but people are friendly to the LGBTQ, etc. community. In this particular Swedenborgian organization, the marriage requirement for pastors could potentially make it difficult for LGBTIQA+ people to be ordained. They do have full legal marriage rights. But the question, if somebody in that community wanted to be ordained, it would probably come up as a question about marriage. And there are really good laws in South Africa that protect the rights of trans and non-binary people. And this is, I found interesting, the three most widely spoken African languages in the New Church in South Africa do not use pronouns that distinguish between male and female. They're just all gender neutral. And the given names of people are mostly gender neutral too. They might express aspirations for the child, like patience or something like that, but they're used for boys and girls. So for somebody to change their gender identity or do what we would call transgender, they would keep their same name and they would still be referred to by the same pronouns. You can't, yeah. So in addition to the teachings about inclusion and the acceptance of all gender identities and loving people who are different from us and the importance of heterosexual marriage, I would also add for this group, Swedenborgian teaching about the importance of learning about good and evil. I say this because gender identity and marriage, marriage and all of those is not that important in this group. And I've also heard that from other African Swedenborgian and New Church groups, that they're just not as fussed about all of that stuff as maybe other groups are. And they are focused on teaching the importance of distinguishing good and evil and regeneration. So from Secrets of Heaven, since good constitutes heaven with a person, while evil constitutes hell, one needs to be thoroughly acquainted with what is good and what evil is. and I won't read the rest of it. Okay, then, because I've only got 3 more minutes and I've got more than 3 minutes of material, so I beg your forgiveness. If you need to leave, no worries. If you're willing to stay for a little bit longer, I will overrun the time and we can have questions. And then the final group that I'm going to look at is the Lord's New Church, which was founded in 1937, and that has a component in North America and also in Europe and also in South Africa. From their website, we in the Lord's New Church believe the Lord commissioned Swedenborg to be a prophet, to be the Lord's instrument to reveal a new divine revelation to the human race. So this community is in one of those that elevates or, considers Swedenborg's writings to be as authoritative as the Old Testament and the New Testament. In my email communications, it was clear that gender identity issues haven't really come up as in the church. There are priests in the Lord's New Church who adamantly oppose any deviation from the one man and one woman model, but there are other priests who are very liberal and would have a different point of view, and there is no overarching policy or statement or anything that has been published on it. There was a personal statement that that they're taking a stand of not knowing and not judging. An important characteristic of the Lord's New Church is that it respects everyone's freedom to come to their own conclusions on any topic, and that would include gender identity. And that's a very strong value in the Lord's New Church. And so because of that, I'd say everything that all the teachings that I've talked about would apply, but also this, because of their emphasis on freedom, Swedenborgian theology about rationality and freedom from divine providence. We have a capacity for disciplined thought and a certain latitude or rationality and freedom. And these two abilities in us are gifts from the Lord. Throughout the whole course of his divine providence, the divine protects these two abilities untouched within us as though they were sacred. And so therefore, in the Lord's New Church, they're treated as very sacred. And as far as like not necessarily believing what priests teach you, individual responsibility, read the word, believe in the Lord, and you will see the truths which should constitute your faith and life. The comment about not judging, the biblical teaching about that would be from Matthew. Do not judge so that you will not be judged. And that scripture from Matthew is used in Swedenborg at the very end of the book Conjugal Love. The upshot of this is that no conclusion must be drawn about anyone having conjugal love or not, either from the way his marriage looks or from any immoral behavior he appears to exhibit. Therefore, do not judge for fear of being condemned. So that's the part of my talk, the most part of my talk about how maybe six different Swedenborgian and New Church organizations have approached this or not approached the question of gender identity. And I do have a few excerpts from a letter that is written by a Swedenborgian New Church person who identifies as agender as well as non-binary, and their pronouns are sie, them, zir. Z has given me permission to share this parts of this letter as a sort of a personal testimonial rather than me giving an analysis of organizational beliefs. I don't find the writings very helpful in this endeavor, and the endeavor was developing a sense of where I stood in terms of politics and philosophy in a wider scale. Because while the writings do present a concrete set of values, even within their pages, there are admissions that the same ways of living do not work for all people, that the best we can do is live by the belief system that we believe in most sincerely, and that there is a path to heaven in all of them. That heaven has a place for people who believe deeply that they aren't meant to be married or that they should be married to more than one person. That we cannot change the minds of people whose natures are different than our own and cause them to be happy where we are. We must accept that they are happiest where they are. Humanity is many many communities, and many belief systems that can all lead to heaven. I did manage to find the kind of information I was seeking in the communities I found myself in online after my divorce. Personal stories that were full of pain, but also full of hope. And the divorce was after a heterosexual marriage. They go on. Halfway through college, I had zero sexual experiences of any kind and very few inclinations in that direction. It was something I wanted to explore, though, and the culture told me that if I wanted to explore it, I needed to get married. Looking back, marriage was an easy commitment for me to make because it didn't mean the same thing to me that it does to other people. I didn't feel that lonely emptiness. I don't. Looking back, I've never been in love, nor felt a calling to find romance. My life is full of friends and family, work and writing and purpose, and I wish I'd known this was an option. There's a word for it. I'm aromantic. Moving on. So after that, when I pursued my interests online, I did so in a more open way than I'd before. I learned about the variations of human experience and built a worldview for myself that made sense, not just with what I'd been taught, but with what I'd experienced and what others are experiencing. And the letter concludes this way: I find it impossible to have any other worldview than the one I have, that the best way to treat people is to accept the paths they've chosen for themselves. So thank you for your attention and for hanging in there even after we're supposed to be finished. And there's some information, questions or something in the chat. Maybe I can look at those. Paige is sharing that in Native American spiritual and cultural traditions, individuals who were termed two-spirit people held social and cultural significant roles. It's an umbrella term for Indigenous people who identify as LGBTQAI+. With Euro-American colonization throughout our continent, Native Americans were forced into the binary colonialism. Yeah. Julie says, I've always felt that description of men and women was too narrow from conjugal love. I was not a doormat as a wife, and my husband could be quite soft. Swedenborg did not know about genetics and have any idea of how different people's genetics are. We need to be inclusive, not exclusive. Thank you, Julie. And she also says, I think the general church became a marriage and kids church, which ostracizes those who couldn't or wouldn't have kids, the unmarried, and those with different sexual identities. So any other comments or questions? Yes, Linda.
I have three things.
Yeah.
The first one is that I really appreciate that you brought up the importance of listening to people's lived experience. And what I'm hoping is that this, well, I guess we could call it a brunch.
I still got my coffee right
Yes,
here.
I know. And I ate a delicious meal. That this could sort of be a preliminary to an actual in-person brunch later on, where we focus on people's lived experience in the areas of LGBTQ+ and how that relates to their faith. And if we can have people come and talk about that, that would be great. But I feel like what we've just done today is a beginning. It's a good beginning, but it's definitely on the side of cognitive rather than emotional. And there's a ton of emotionality around this issue. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I find it fascinating that Swedenborg talks about the polygamous heavens and the aesonons on the outskirts of heaven, and that those are two deviations from the heteronormative monogamous idea that Swedenborg is promoting. Those are the two that were probably most acceptable at the time.
Yes.
Like he could talk about those at the time because that was something that was considered at least somewhat acceptable. And then the third thing is that I feel like the general church, in having such a strong focus and idealization of monogamous heterosexual marriage, sort of backed itself into a corner. And it's like, I don't think that's ever, how do I put this? I don't want to speculate about people's motives, but I think that the general church as a whole has been sort of caught flat-footed, taken by surprise by the dramatic shift, the dramatic social, cultural shift that we've experienced with acceptance of different experiences of sexuality and gender, and really doesn't know what to do with that except condemn it. And it's like, and I feel like the general church doesn't want to be in a position of condemning people who are different. It's just they feel like I'm speculating about people's intentions. They feel like condemnation or non-acceptance is the only path they can take and be true to their faith. So I don't think they're doing it out of malice. So I guess that was everything I wanted to say. But it's all such an interesting topic. So thanks for that.
Yeah, and I think about your last bit, that behavior that you're observing perhaps in the leadership of the general church fits with what I said about any community, whether it's in the Swedenborgian or Jewish, Muslim, whatever faith community. That part of that community that is very upholds the text very highly and very literally is much more likely to be condemning of anything that is not traditional belief systems in anything, but especially anything to do with cultural, because culturally changes. Yeah. I don't think I said that very well, but I think you got my drift. I see Jess had a hand up. Yep.
So I had two thoughts on Liz's presentation. Thank you so much. Very comprehensive and thorough. It's interesting because I've been doing a lot of research. I just got my master's degree in special education on race. And I wonder briefly about your thoughts on race as a social construct, as well as gender, if you've done any research in that as well.
I think sociologists generally also consider race as a social construct. I think primarily formed for reasons of economically taking advantage of people with different skin colors. There's nothing inherently, different or less human about a person who has a different skin color, the same way there's nothing less human about a person who has different genitals. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that I'm positive the discipline I come from in sociology would also see that as socially constructed.
Yeah, thanks. And then you had a little note you touched on about like in adolescence, kind of going through a phase where maybe it's the cool thing to do to be bisexual, or just exploring your identity. So like, what is your sexual identity? What is your gender? And I think this is such a new thing, and I've definitely seen it as a parent. I have teenagers and their peers, and it's definitely something that you and I didn't think about. I don't think anyone here kind of went through a phase where, I have to figure out right? It was either you knew or you didn't even think about it, right? So I'm not saying it's a phase for people, but I do see it as part of identity formation now in adolescents and teens. And I think that's fine, right? Because if we're not making sex a sin or gender expression a sin, then it doesn't matter. Of course, you want to figure out who you are, just like you want to figure out if you like sports or music or, and I think a lot of, and this kind of comes down to, I guess, more Roz's part of the talk. What does the church and the various churches consider sinful, right? And I feel like I've been doing research and reading and listening to podcasts and such on something called purity culture. And that just like has general church written all over it for me. And what I find most ironic is that they can't see the harm that it does to so many people. And I feel like their idea of marriage is maybe what marriage is in heaven, and they're trying to put that into an earthly scenario where you can't. So the difference between marriage and heaven that they're trying to force everyone into here on earth, it doesn't work at all. So for me, doing some research on purity culture has really helped me realize, wow, I was raised in this and I had no idea all the negative effects it was having on so many people until I kind of started looking at it. So thank you so much, Roz and Liz. This was really good to be thinking about this topic. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Oh, you're welcome. That's awesome.
I see a few more comments in the chat. There's a request for my presentation, to be accessible. And so Liz and I will work on that, maybe a PowerPoint that we could put up or a document or something like that. So we'll let you know. And Paige is thanking Linda for raising the dichotomy between organized analytical information and lived experience. And yep, we do have educational hegemony where we leave our full selves aside and just focus on the intellectual information and lived experience. I tried to kind of balance it with a letter, but maybe didn't come off that way. And
It was a good start. It was a good start.
Good start. And I totally agree. I wasn't trying to be the end and answer all the questions. I was just trying to open it up. And this is what I see. And maybe part of the purpose of that is when you see that there's different ways that Swedenborgians and New Church people approach this, and the perspectives and the conclusions or the non-conclusions, the inability to come to a conclusion, it might help you in any of your thinking about this subject. Like, oh, no, where do I fit on this spectrum?
Yeah, I definitely can agree that my presentation was very definitions heavy, because I feel like we have so many new words and so many new ideas, at least from what I was raised in, which was the general church. So I feel like before I can even start a conversation about people's lived experience, I have to know what an aromantic person is, because if I don't know what that is and why romantic identity might not be the same as like a sexual identity, then I can't I have a hard time even understanding what somebody might be trying to convey to me. So that's why I thought we could start with some definitions.
Right. Oh, Robin's suggesting this could be a workshop or convention. Excellent idea. And we're going to be in person in California so far. So good. Fingers crossed. So maybe we can get Liz to come. We can do it together. Paige has also given us another resource for an article in September, October issue of Change magazine. The Walls Between Us Have Doors, honoring transgender student stories as an entryway to just, equitable, and inclusive practice. That would be something that you could search online. I wish there was a way to preserve this. I guess I could copy it and paste it into an email. I've seen somebody do that, but I'm not sure if I have the skill for that.
It's in the Roz, it's in the 3 buttons where it says more at the bottom of the chat.
Oh, more.
And then you can
Save the chat. Oh, okay.
it saves. I forget where it saves it on your computer, but
Oh, okay. I think when I close the meeting, then I'll be able to get access to it, right? Probably. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, unless there's something else.
Thanks. I have to go.
Yep.
That's great.
Good. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.